Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to be discussing AC/DC, their Back in Black album, but I'll be doing that not only just for the album's sake, because man, what a great album that is, but also we're going to be discussing just when is it that a band needs to just give up and call it a day, and when is it that a band, by either bringing on a new member or various new members, have a second crack at their career. Now, we've talked about bands like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. There were 4 of them in those bands. The Police, there were 3 in that band, and all members of those bands were irreplaceable. You couldn't replace Ringo, you certainly couldn't have replaced John Bonham, and I can't think of a single member of the Police that you could get rid of and still call that band the Police. But we're also going to be talking about what genre is AC/DC after all. And let's start off with that. You know, I've always been kind of miffed at the whole metal community. They have wound up by subgenrealizing that whole subgenre of rock to the point that even heavy metal heads argue about whether this band or that band are actually heavy metal. And when I was doing research for AC/DC, there was a whole lot of draw for them to, in their earlier career, to either be identified as glam, they kind of started that themselves, or punk was actually used to describe them, and of course, heavy metal. Now, the band right away said, we are not a punk band. And they survived that little nomenclature quite well by standing up. They said, we are basically just a hard, basic rock band. And you know what? I agree with them. When I looked up the information, I always look up Wikipedia, to see if there's anything that I could possibly use in my videos. Often not. They stated that one of the reasons that AC/DC isn't considered heavy metal by some heavy metal fans is because of their lack of modality. Okay, are these the same heavy metal fans that don't see Deep Purple as a heavy metal band? What about Richie Blackmore and John Lord, both of them modality players? So I don't know. I don't think you're going to get 2 metal fans to totally agree on 10 bands anyway. But let's get back to this album. The reason I chose this album is, first of all, this is a damn great album, folks. And guess what? This is the second best-selling album of all time. I guess that's underneath Michael Jackson's Thriller, and it's the highest-selling band album of all time. How did that happen? Well, I'll tell you how that happened. They put together an album where there is not a single weak cut on this album, and at least 3 hits along with that. You know what? That's one of the things I've always loved about AC/DC. Talk about a hard rock band that can write a song. On top of that, with 2 different incarnations, which included not just the singer being replaced, but a songwriter as well, let's face it, and yet they somehow survived that and gave us this album. Now, Bon Scott was involved at the very beginning when they first started putting this album together, and there are rumors he's on a few tracks, but only as a drummer or percussionist. And by the time the album was really properly being recorded, he was already dead. Now, there was a lot of talk by the band as to who would take over vocals. As a matter of fact, when Bon Scott first died, the band thought of just folding it up. And you know what? Bon Scott is one of those singers. You can't just get anybody to replace him. And one of the things that I love about bringing Brian on for AC/DC is not only did he have the range and the grit that Bon Scott supplied, of course, but he had the same damn tonality to his voice. You could swear on certain cuts it's Bon Scott being resurrected right in front of your face. This album wasn't just a hard, in-your-face rock album with some very radio-friendly cuts on top of that, but it's the way the album starts off. The church bell, I suppose. That's what I hear when I listen to the first cut on this album. And of course, as a fan, you know that Bon Scott had just passed away. Is this in memorial to him as a singer? Or is it a church bell ringing out yet a new hour? You know what? I think it's a little bit of both. Now, the band was very lucky to get a hold of Brian, and I'll tell you why. Because it wasn't just a matter of getting a frontman. They needed somebody who could help write material, and Brian not only fit into that need, but he did it very well, as was demonstrated several times. And talk about a band with a second chance, third chance, fourth chance. These guys, every once in a while, just nail you in the face with just a superior product. The only band that comes to mind that covers it that well is in prog rock, and I'm talking about Yes. Now, I'm going to digress with Yes here just for a minute, folks. Yes, to me, was a great band, and you know what? I liked several incarnations of that band. But my favorite incarnation and my favorite album by them was played by that incarnation, Close to the Edge. You got John Anderson, Rick Wakeman, Steve Howe, Chris Squire, and Bill freaking Bruford. And you know what? Yes, although they would prove they could swap out certain members and even come up with some new kind of approaches to music by doing so, even updating their sound, they never quite sounded again like they did with Bruford behind the sticks. Now, I love Alan White. Alan White was a great drummer, and he was the drummer the night that I went to see Yes. And I have no problem with his drumming. I was a fan of him ever since I first heard of him on the Plastic Ono Band when he joined Eric Clapton, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and produced one of rock's best one-sided albums. Side 2, frankly, bores the hell out of me, as does Yoko for the most part. But, you know, all of that leads to my question for the tribe tonight, and I really want to hear from you folks in the comments. What bands, first of all, can you name that had a second career by swapping either one or a couple of key members, and they became, because of that, as successful as they were before, or even more successful? And of course, that leads to the second half of my question for you tonight. When is it that a band is no longer a band? You know, for me, the Beatles, one Beatle gone, they're no longer the Beatles. Same thing with the Police, as I've said, and of course, Led Zeppelin. You know, I think the Stones have suffered from this over the decades. To me, the Stones need Brian Jones to truly be the Rolling Stones. Now, that doesn't mean the Stones didn't put out, some people would even argue that the second incarnation of the Stones was their best musicianship, you know, kind of lineup, and I would have to agree with that. But you know what? There was something about Brian Jones. Now, he wasn't one of their major writers. That was Mick, that was Keith, but there's something. He started that band, and you know what? It was his attitude that somehow translated, or they just lost whatever they had when he was kicked out of the band. But either way, they've had several different incarnations and they've been quite successful. Less successful for me often the further they go down the road. Of course, Bridges to Babylon being the one album that I think is of their third incarnation that I like almost as well as some of their earlier albums. But what do you guys think? You know, we've talked about this on this channel many times, haven't we? I don't like Foreigner. I don't think it's Foreigner. I think it should be called Foreigner's Ghost, with one member who may or may not show up. Evidently, they're not too far from folding up here from what I'm reading in the latest articles. Good riddance. But that's just one band that has gone several steps too far for me. And what bands are out there touring now, like Foreigner, that you no longer think are that band just because there's been too many lineup changes. Leonard Skinner comes to mind as well. All right, that's my video for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. That helps the YouTube algorithm better identify the channel. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to the channel as of yet, it is so easy. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, then tap that top bell icon, and you'll be notified of all my future videos dealing with not only the classic rock era, but the era that we're in and the era that we're heading into. We try to cover our bases on the channel. All right, folks, I'm Michael Noland, and together, your comments, my videos, we become the tribe. And I'll see you in my next video.